I have the pleasure of being with you actually for an hour. So if there's one thing you need to remember is that you need to stay curious, competent, and courageous. And I have slides, so I'm hoping that we can get the slides up. There we go. Well, I should go back then to one. So I've been asked to talk about the history and the future of corporate responsibility. And yes, I have, dating myself here, 30 years or perhaps a little bit more now, working with companies in this field. But just before we start, and again, thank you for the introduction, perhaps when we talk about the future of corporate responsibility, I want to say that I'm no longer working with an accounting audit firm, no longer practicing that, but I'm using it every single day. And I have the pleasure now of educating board members, investors, executives on ESG, so environment, social governance. And I have the help of a lot of fantastic people, and you see some of them here on the slide. And again, one of the things I would say, they're curious, they're competent, and they are courageous. And I think that is some of the things we should take forward. When I look at the history of corporate responsibility, let me just start with a poll question. Let me know what generation you were when you were born. I was almost going to say, but what generation do you belong to? And you see here, there's the greatest generation, the silent generation, baby boomers, and so we go. So please go to the poll question and let me know. All right. Let's see. Generation X. Millennials, baby boomers, no one from the greatest generation. Well, it looks like we have a good mix. Forth and back here. I don't know how many we are expecting to hear from. Let's see. At the moment, almost 50% Generation X. This is almost like the race on the standards in this field. It looks like we have Generation X, millennials, and baby boomers in the audience. Maybe we can go back while people are looking at this. So why I want to do that is because I'm, of course, talking about the history, and here are a few people that influenced me when I did my master's thesis and when I started to become an accountant. First, we have this gentleman on the left that wrote The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. He was the father of capitalism. He was the one with the invisible hand. And he actually belongs to the generation of awakened, or the generation of liberty. Sorry, I had to look at my notes here. So he was born just in between then. And then came another gentleman, Milton Friedman. He belongs to the greatest generation. And he talked about the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. So we have on one hand Adam Smith in terms of the father of capitalism, and you might see the smokestacks behind him. That was where we really started the industrialization. And then we had Milton Friedman later on talking about the business of business is business. So there is one thing that these gentlemen might not have embedded into their thoughts, and that was externalities. So a few years later in 1972, this book came along, The Limits to Growth. You might be able to see that the price of this book was $2.75. So a bit have happened since 1972. They put in a chart, as you see here, that talked about these limits to growth. how we would see pollution rise, how we would see that the food per capita would rise, how do we see the death of people going down, how do we see birth actually getting down, resources getting further and further down. But if you start following this graph, you would see that there are some predictions that is actually really scary, such as the death, such as the food per capita, etc. And what they talked about here was the limits to growth. Later on came a book in terms of Beyond the Limits. Then a few years later, another very important book came out. That was in 1987, and Our Common Future. They wrote at the start of this book that when they started this in October 1984, and to when they published this report 900 days later in 87, there were a few things that had happened. Personally, I remember the Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosions. There was a lot of others, as you see here, drought triggered, killing people, leak from pesticides, liquid gas, agricultural chemicals, drinking water, etc. So this was where the world was starting to say, oh, there's a limit to growth. What is it that are the consequences, the impact of our way of doing business? The person behind this report was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Norwegian prime minister at that point. And the report said that sustainable development is development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And by the way, according to all my generations, she belongs to the silent generation. I'm not quite sure that is the right word for her. She's a very fantastic woman that is really fighting still. Then now I come into the picture. In 1990, I was doing my business law degree, and I was starting my degree also of becoming a state authorized public accountant. It's called in Denmark. So my master's thesis, I was about to see what should I write about. And I wrote, I was reading the newspaper and I saw an article by this gentleman, Leo Alsing, who was at the Technical University in Denmark. And he was talking about life cycle cost. He was talking about how do we produce products in a way where we look at the product and therefore start to have not only the end product in mind, but what are the consequences on environment, water, energy in the whole life cycle of that product. I got very excited. I picked up the phone. Yes, and at that point we did not have cell phones, so it was a real phone. And I called this professor and I asked him, can you use someone like me who's starting to do a master thesis within accounting at a technical university? He said yes. And I were starting to learn about all the chemical things that I have to admit I never was really good at in school. But what this gentleman did was then he said, I want to send you to the Danish Steelwork. The Danish Steelwork were in a town where other steelworks were, and there was a lot of complaints from the people within the town that the smell was bad. There was a lot of pollution in the air. There was dead fish in the sea. And at that point, and let's think back to Adam Smith and the smokestacks. At that point, we basically made smokestacks higher, and we made the pipelines out in the sea longer, because in that way we got rid of the pollution. The Danish Steelwork believed that they were not part of the problem, or at least not as much as everyone else. And they wanted to show that to the public. So they wanted to see how can we include in our annual report how we use our materials and how much we pollute and what we do in that regard. So I was put into the Danish steelwork and put a helmet on out and seeing the steelwork, but also asked, how do we report this? How do we communicate that? So what you see in front of you is the green account from the Danish steelwork back from 1991 that I, together with the people at the steelwork, of course, ended up saying, this is the way we are showcasing the input and the output of the process. Rob Gray, who was a fantastic person out of in the University of Dundee, put it in his book, and I was very, very proud. I was a young, just starting at that point. I finished my master thesis, and I actually found it then to do this presentation for you today. And I have to admit, I got a little bit sad because I was looking at what I wrote at that point. So the thesis was informative, true and fair environmental reporting. And I said, and this is back from 94, if current trends continue, scenarios could be set up regarding the future of corporations and the climate situation. And then I reached up to trends. And then I, saying the corporations which did not see the possibilities and barriers of environmental issues in time, and therefore did not adapt to environmental friendly production, have declared bankruptcy. We might not be there yet, but I do think this is the last call for companies to really start not only reporting, but also including environmental, social into all their processes. You also see that I highlighted that as such, sustainable accounting will approach financial accounting. And I end up saying that we basically this will bring about sustainable development regulated through the mechanism of the free market. Think about Adam Smith and the invisible hand. So that's a few years back, but I'm actually thinking if I should translate the report as such to see. Then I started at PW, Price Waterhouse, and was giving the opportunity to work on developing a practice for PW within environment at that point. And I got to work for the Danish legislation in terms of how do we embed reporting requirements into the Annual Reporting Act. The first thing was this report on the annual environmental report that came out in 1995. Then in 1996, something happened. The whole world looked at this little boy that you see here stitching together football, and there was discussions about sweatshops and the impact of our way of producing by sending production to other countries. What's the social impact of that? So this was Nike, that in terms of their sweatshop issues. You also had Gap, you had many other companies. And I started to work with both that Nike, but also IKEA and other companies on how do you develop a supply chain management system that's responsible? How do you put the code of conduct? How do you train not only the suppliers, but also procurement in that? So that was back in 1996. Then in 97, some of you might have heard of GRI, Global Reporting Initiative. That was actually founded in Boston in 1997. It's now headquartered in Amsterdam, but this came out of this public outcry in terms of Exxon Valdez oil spill. So that was back in 1997. And now, as you many know, that the Global Reporting Initiative, that is a standard that many companies over the whole world are following in terms of reporting. And accountants are signing and giving the assurance statement on that. Just to say that was the time where we very much talked about reputation. So this book, Waltzing with the Raptors, good person worked with that put that out, and talking about how do we start to look at our stakeholders? How do we ensure that we understand what are the implications of what we do on the stakeholders, and therefore have that relationship with the stakeholders. At the same time, the other book that you see here, it's in Danish, but it says Social Accounts, and that was a book that I got to write about how do we report about social factors, about environmental health and safety issues. This was actually for the financial sector. CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, came along in 2000. They said, how do we transform the capital market? What Sarah was talking about before. How do we transform the capital market by making environmental reporting, risk management, a new business norm? 2000. That is what? 21 years ago. At that point, they just had 35 investors. Now they have so many more. So that was the Carbon Disclosure Project that's still going strong. Another, and perhaps a little bit more fun thing, value reporting. And some of you will know that now we have two standards, and I will come back to that, called SASB and the integrated reporting that is starting to become value reporting. But this is back also in 2000, and I am really dating myself, and I thought like, hey, why not just put it out there? Some of you might know a gentleman named Bob Eccles. Bob Eccles, and then it's me, if anyone can see that. I don't understand how Bob Eccles can keep looking exactly like himself while I clearly look 21 years older. But nevertheless, this is how the original value reporting was set up from PwC. We looked at all of the things you see in this spider web, and out of this came also a book in terms of the value reporting revolution. I really was very clear that I believe that we should have environment, social, reputational issues into this value reporting framework. And I was very, very proud when I succeeded in that. So you'll see in terms of the value creating activities in this framework that was put out at that point, that we both now say, what are the value creating activities for customers, people, innovation, brand, supply chain, environmental, social, and ethical. So that, again, a few years back. Then I took this framework and I said, okay, how do we really embed this framework for real? Instead of just writing about it, how do we put this into a real company? Novozymes, which is a biotechnology company out of Denmark, got to work with them on producing what is now the first integrated report in the world. And I've taken here a few things. You can find the report online. I think one of the things that's very important for us as CPAs or accountants, I should say, I'm a state authorized public accountant and what you call CPA, but that is that we have the accounting policies. We actually can say, this is how this number or whatever it is has been calculated or embedded. So you'll see that we say here that the data for 2000-2001 for the environment and bioethics and social responsibility included in the annual report, so this integrated report, is based on data from the previously environmental and social report. So we actually, at that point, we had one report on social, one report on environment, some had one report on intellectual capital, and then the financial report. So by including these, we started to have this integrated report. You also see the knowledge resource data as intellectual capital data. they were starting to be included from 2002. I also included that data has been selected on the basis of concrete assessment of the data of particular significance to Novozymes' ability to maintain its long-term financial viability. And they also say, we also believe that the data of greatest relevance to our key stakeholders has been included. If you could read it, you could see that I actually signed this as the statement that for Novozymes. Then came a few other books here in terms of the public trust was something that was very much up in the time at that time as well. There was a book about the corporate values and responsibility. So we really started to talk about what are the values, the purpose, but also again, how do we strengthen the responsibility of corporate social responsibility in global supply chains. And corporate social responsibility, CSR, is a term some still use. Some say, no, that's very, very old. Now let's talk ESG or responsibility. You know, we have used so many names. There was one person that I had the pleasure of meeting back in 2003, this guy, Michael Porter, who actually came to Denmark at that point and talked about corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility as being something that companies should not do. They should look at what, that was just giving money away. And I think there was a few people in the audience saying, no. Corporate social responsibility is not about giving money away. It's about how you make your money. Porter smart and put together this in terms of corporate social responsibility and corporate philanthropy. And as many of you might also know, he's also very smart in terms of putting up shared value proposition. But I think he's on to something where there's many people that think that corporate philanthropy is, well, now we've made a lot of money, let's then go and make sure we pay back. That's all good. I'm not saying don't. But what we're talking about is how do we make our money? How do we ensure that we in the value chain, how do we ensure that in our processes, etc., make the profit in a way where it is responsible? I think that is the big distinction here. A few other things came along, and in 2005, Helle produced the global scenarios for 2025. I'm still looking at them. It's actually a fantastic way of looking at the scenarios of the future. Just heard in terms of the case in the Netherlands here last week, but there, if you look at these, you'll see the 4 different scenarios that they have included. One is about living in a world where we have free trade, and another is living in a world where everyone is saying no, we just have enough for ourselves. I think that the judge is still out on that, where we are going, especially now after the pandemic. In the year after came an inconvenient truth by Al Gore in terms of the crisis of global warming. The year after that, I got to work. Well, I had worked with them before, but Dong Energy, the Danish oil and natural gas, that is now known as Ørsted. And I included this, and I have more assurance statements that I've had the pleasure of signing, but also, of course, going through all of the reporting and the documentation of companies. But I included this because you see that this scope of our work, that we use the ISO 3000, so the International Audit Standard. And I think that it's important, and I know that a lot of work is going on now in terms of what standards are we using as accountants when we go out and put our signature. people need to know, and I think we said before that, protect the public. Well, you can't protect the public if the public can't understand what you're signing, and if it's just what some might say a rubber stamp. So I think it is, again, we need to be curious, we need to be competent, but we also need to be courageous and call out if there's something that should not be. And you see cases all the time, and you can ask, where were the board, but you can also ask, where were the accountants? So a lot on your shoulders. In 2009, we also had this gentleman starting to talk about the planetary boundaries framework. This is Johan Rockström, and he started to look into what was the boundaries. Think back to where I said that we just put longer smokestacks and longer pipelines. What is the boundaries of the natural resources? What are the externalities of the way that we are producing at the moment? And if you look at it here, it has everything from climate change to freshwater use, etc. So a lot of these points that's actually also embedded then in the sustainable development goals. In 2009, and this is where you start saying, okay, there's a lot of happened here. But in 2009, I was asked to move to 2008, but nevertheless to the US and lead the PwC sustainability and climate change practice. And I was asked by New York Times in terms of this, the big four of accounting will be among the big winners if US adopts climate law. So that was back in 2009. And I went on record saying that the way we see it is that it should be implemented, integrated into what we normally do. So my vision was that when we went out and did tax advice, we would definitely think about responsibility. When we went out and do strategy advice, the same. When we did our audits, of course, embedded it in the audit, advisory services, etc. Needless to say, there might not have been as much take off as I wanted at that time. But I do believe that now is the time for not only the big four, but all the accounting firms to really look into see how do we embed ESG into all our practice functions. How do we ensure that we don't go out and advise a company to do something that will be less beneficial for both the company and the society in a few years to come? How do we go in and help the companies really embed understanding, having the mindset of ESG, and therefore be among the leaders in the future? In 2010, we saw the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IRC, was formed, and a year later we had SASB that was formed, so the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And when I put up these numbers, 2010, 2011 and 2021, it was almost magic to say that in 2021 we will have these two organizations coming together into the Value Reporting Foundation. So I have to admit I was laughing a bit when I heard the Value Reporting Foundation, and I did call a few of my good friends from the time at PwC and said, hey, have anyone asked in terms of the Value Reporting Foundation? But I'm quite sure that everyone is happy with that name, because I think this is what we need to start thinking about. What are we reporting about? Are we reporting about dollars and cents, or are we reporting about values? and value. And I think that is something we need to start really understanding. That goes to if we talk about stranded assets, it goes to if we talk about what are the real value of the different programs that companies are putting in place in terms of transition now. If you look at it for a short period of time, no, you might not see the return on investment. But if you look at it from a longer perspective and from a perspective of stewardship, it definitely do give the value. So let me now turn to the future of corporate responsibility, and I'm not going to talk so much about TCFD and again this value reporting, etc. But I am just thought I would include this. All of these pictures are from the 5th curriculum of the enterprise value creation that Mervyn King and the Good Governance Academy held a few weeks back, where you had ACA, you had IFAC, you had all the players within the accounting sphere, and you see a few pictures here. It looks messy. I think it will be a bit messy. You have at the moment clearly the different the SASB, the IRC going together, but you also have with GRI, there's statements where how they work together. You have the World Economic Forum together with the accounting companies putting metrics together. A lot of different ways to look at this. Going back to my master thesis, I wanted to embed externalities. I wanted to embed the prices of the real prices into the financial accounts, and then we were done. Because if we had the externalities embedded both in terms of the positive and the negative externalities, well, then the invisible hand and the market would choose the right companies to invest in, and we would pay for the products in the right way, etc. A lot of much more sophisticated models out now than the models I put together. But I do think it's important for us to understand that we are seeing now this integration with also IFRS, SEC. Can't really name anyone who's not talking about how do we start to integrate sustainability into the traditional reporting. I said, or you said in terms of IMP project, where I'm working in terms of the digitalization working group, the accounting for sustainability. A4S is doing fantastic work on a lot of different things. Everyone is working on this, so it is honestly very, very exciting, and I do look back and I say, wow, when I handed in my master thesis 30 years ago, and my professor looked at me and looked at it and said, you have a very good imagination. This is very interesting thoughts, but it will never happen. And so it is quite amazing to see that this is happening as we speak here. The other thing I wanted to then touch upon is, what does stewardship in the 21st century look like? And I think we can talk about the standards. We can talk about how do we provide assurance and all of this. But there are some fundamentals that I think we both as leaders, as practitioners, need to keep in mind. And stewardship in the 21st century, and I should say that these findings are based on a survey we did of board members, experts, investors all over the world. Stewardship in the 21st century is a strong sense of purpose. And I think we all need to think about that. What is the purpose, not only of the business, but what is the purpose of the board? What is the purpose of, you doing your daily work in terms of being accountant or making decisions on investment, etc. Have that sense of purpose. Transparent. How do we ensure that we are transparent, so that we reflect on all the interests of all the stakeholders? Trust. I said before that was building public trust. It will continue, and I think we need it more than ever. So you need to be trustworthy. You need to have the confidence by the community, in the company, in your work, and drive this long-term sustainable value creation. Ethics, integrity is clear, that we all need to have that. And then this well-being, and promote health and well-being, it says here, and dissolve the systemic inequalities. Another thing I think we need to start seeing, how do we embed that into everything we do? Another question we asked was what does a future prepared board member look like? And think about it. When you go out, if it's from an accountant point of view or from a company point of view, how do you want board members to look at the findings? Is it just to let's get the best result, but I don't ask me how we get there? Or is it to really have this ability to prioritize what is important, have the long-term focus, have the integrity, be transparent and accountable, have a drive in terms of what is the culture, have the emotional intelligence, be collaborative, be an open listener and adaptive? I think there's a lot of words in here that's very, very important, not only for board members, but for leaders all over the world. The other question we asked was, what new competences are or should be demanded of board members? And again, I believe that whatever we do, the board needs to be involved, the board needs to understand, being that the transition plan in terms of climate, being that in terms of what is it that the stakeholders are asking for, being that what is it actually we are signing. And I do believe that we need to ensure that the board is signing off, not only on the financials, but on also the sustainability, the ESG measures, and how those things interact, how we have the integrated reporting, who are the key stakeholders, have we the right budget in place to actually get to our transition plan, what is our ability to challenge, what is our education and experience, what is the transformational leadership do we have in terms of cyber and other things, supply chain, ESG, stakeholder focused, and of course high standard for ethics. Sustainable development goals, which I haven't really talked about, but it's the 17 goals of the biggest pain points in the world that was agreed by 193 member states of the UN, and where all countries are pushing towards these 17 sustainable development goals, but also a lot of companies are reporting to see how do they impact the sustainable development goals, either positively or negatively. And last, but definitely not least on this slide, climate competent. It is, you can't say, well, that's not going to go away. It's not. You need to ensure that you are, and all the leaders and everyone around you are climate competent. The last here is the personal traits, and have the heart, be inclusive, committed to diversity, equity. As I said before, be curious, be competent, and have the courage. Have the entrepreneurship mindset, have empathy, but also be pragmatic, be humble, but also innovative and creative in how you look at things. We have way too often, I've seen that we've looked at like, well, this is how it is, but no one asked, but why is this how it is? I think we need to look at all the different things we're doing on a daily basis and ask ourselves the question, could we do this in a better way? And I say all of this comes from this report, the Future Boardroom Competences Report. You're of course more than welcome to download that, and but also let me know what's missing. What is it that you believe should be included in the report in terms of personal traits or competences that we don't have? And then we have put out this call for top 100 competent boards and top 100 competent board members. So if any of you should be nominated, or you know people that should be nominated, please include it. I think if we don't have the tone at the top, it is harder for the accountants, it's harder for all the other in our organization to actually promote sustainable development and ESG competences. And last but not least, as you see in this slide, develop your own competences. And of course, I would be happy to see also in terms of the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program. So with that, not so beautiful slide, but this should say question and answers. So.
Yes. Wow, Helle, so much to unpack there. I would say, even though as long as that CV was to read about you, what you gave us there really gave us an indication that there's so much more. I loved what you talked about in terms of the historical aspect and that foundation that built, and then, what it's really exciting, what the future holds. I love your conversation around, the stewardship and where CPAs come in as part of this with the, with purpose, with transparency, being trustworthy. Ethics and integrity have always been a key pillar of the profession. The health and well-being aspect and dissolving, the systemic inequalities. I think that really ties nicely to this for when we look at the UN 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously those are integral to everything business is doing. But it looks like we've got a lot of questions for you, so I'm going to dive in. The first one is, how do we ensure that the standards in reporting are real so that the actual company actions are properly reflected in the reporting? Is it ESG reporting audits?
Well, it is a really good question. And I mean, I'm thankful for all of the people that works on this at the point. I've said to a few, and I'll share that with you now, that I've done my fair share of assurance of these data. And I remember a company when I went out and they had this great report that they wanted us to sign off on and do the assurance. And I went to this wonderful person that was responsible for some of the data. I said, can I have the documentation? That's what we do. And she said, sure. And then she took from behind her Post-it notes, small yellow Post-it notes, and handed them to me. And I said, yeah, I'm writing the number down every month. Okay, so good accountant as an assurance provider, I counted the number of Post-it notes. There was only 11. And I say, there's only 11 and it's 12 months. And she looked and she, there's one that went on the floor. And she picked up this Post-it note from the floor, and okay, well, I mean, hey, however you put it down. And I said, how did you get this information? And she said, well, I called the production. And then it continued. I think what's important here is, one thing is to say, yes, we need to have some standards where we know how are we actually measuring these numbers in the same way as we have IFRS, FASB, etc. But the next thing is, we of course need to ensure that the people that have this information in the companies understand the rigor that we normally put in looking at documentation. We also need to understand, and I have been shocked so many times where we have companies that are using a lot of resources on putting systems together that are totally separate from the financial system. And I said, well, if somebody have paid for water, they are by definition responsible for checking that they actually received the water. I know we can't do it with everything, but there are so many measures that we already have signed off. We have signed off it in financial terms, but in order to sign off it in financial terms, we should actually have signed off it also in terms of, yes, we have received the water, yes, we have received energy, yes, we have received so much else. Right? So you actually have a lot of information already that you can start reconcile.
Right. Well, interesting. The going to the Warrior Accountants report, I remember in the executive summary there was a reference to impact washing, and I think this next question sort of connects to that a bit. How can a company like Nestle have a high ESG rating when it takes groundwater and puts it in plastic bottles? Could it be, quote, gaming the reporting systems?
I'm no doubt that there's so much that's happening in different ways, and it goes back to actually the previous question: what does the standard look like? We also have that top 5 companies in terms of the ratings and rankings, that might be a tobacco company or something like that, and you can say, yes, you can do a lot on the ground, but is it the product you're looking at? Is it how you're producing it? Is it how well you are to actually report into some of these ratings and rankings? There's so much going on in that. So we need to ensure that we look at the system, and we look at how do we ensure that we really have the right information that we are including into the system, and then we have the auditors to look at it. But at the moment, yes, you can argue, no one have, if you don't know what standard you're using, if you don't know the information that's being put into it, and if the assurance provider is not really saying, okay, I found this data there and there, and I put it into the system, and I checked all of these different things, yeah, your guess is as good as mine, right? And I should say, I've worked with a lot of companies that actually did amazingly better than they were able to communicate. So I was able to go in and help them communicate it better, and therefore get a better rating. But you also have those that are very, very good at communicating. And so what is perception and reality? How do we ensure that is actually aligned?
Yeah, that communication piece is important, and as going back to your stewardship pillars, the trustworthiness and the transparency there, and that's being demanded more and more. This is kind of connected as well. There are so many sustainability standards for measurement or disclosure. Is there any chance for one global standard like IFRS for financial reporting?
Yes, there is, and we're working on it. Do I believe that there might be you have one from the U.S. and as we have now, right? We have IFRS and FASB. I hope that we will get to have one, and that is what everyone is working on. But of course, it's a lot of not invented here, and and not mine. And I hope we need it. We definitely need it. And I think that there is a recognition from many to work together. And that's where you see, all the SASB, the IRC, the GRI, the CDPs, together with the World Economic Forum, etc., and IMP, so the project, that is kind of like forming all of them, and we are now going into the IFRS and IFAC and YOSCO, and so sorry for all of these alphabet soup names. But a lot is happening at the moment, and yes, I believe that we will be going towards one standard, perhaps two, but that is better than 13 or more that we have at the moment.
Yes, and some consistency across the board. We have a question now from Brian. Should governments simply ban things like Bitcoin mining and one-way plastic containers? Is regulation more effective than corporate reporting and disclosure?
So, and it goes back to actually my master's thesis report. Clearly, banning or regulation, normally that is the latest point, right? Normally you have that you get the legislation because something went wrong. Often we don't start by saying, this is how we want it to be, so let's legislate for that. We expect that there is the stewardship, we expect all of that, and when we then see something goes wrong, we start to legislate. So yes, you could go in and do that. What the European Union is doing at the moment is close to that, and will force companies from all over the world to say, if you want to sell in Europe, here are the conditions, right? You can argue that the big asset managers, you can argue that the banks, you can argue that the U.S. government is putting out and saying, we are not going to have products produced in this and this way. So it's not necessarily legislation, but you have the power of procurement that is really taking place at the moment. And I think let's see. Clearly, we have the courts both in Australia last week had an Australia court in terms of saying that the environmental minister had a duty of care when she decides if she is going to give an approval to a company in terms of, I think it's coal mine. In the Netherlands, you have the court actually going in, which is very interesting, and putting demand on a company, Shell, to do something in the future, which is, a lot of people are arguing, well, should that be the court, or should that be legislation that's saying, in our country, we want 45%. You clearly had Exxon in terms of the shareholders going in and saying, we expect something else, and therefore this little hedge fund that gets at least 2 seats at the boardroom table. So you have a lot of different forces than necessarily legislation, but clearly that is part of it.
Yeah, definitely happening from boardroom to courtroom now. Isabella says, I love the remark, are we reporting on dollars, cents, or are we reporting on values or value? How do we go about reporting on values? Is it quantifiable?
Well, so I started my career on life cycle cost, and how do we price all of this, and how do we price the externalities, and how do we embed it into it, and you can say, what you measure, you manage, and if we can't measure it, it is harder to manage. However, I think we can go about it with this integrated report and this integrated reporting framework, where we really start not only to put the numbers, but also the context around those numbers. And we produce it in a way and we communicate it in a way where we not give you so much information that nobody's actually going to read it, but very in contextual, ensure that it is a story that is a true story and talks about the values, but also how is that impacting both in financial terms, but also in non-financial terms, stakeholders.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more sort of what we're calling, mission-led companies, and tying it back to that overall mission of the company. Patrick's question: how can we leverage our recent experience with a pandemic to promote and expand the development of ESG within companies?
Say that again. How can we
leverage the recent experience we've had with the pandemic to promote and expand the development of ESG within companies? I suppose maybe it's the question is like, taking it from the perspective of we've had all these externalities that we weren't prepared for.
No, I hear you, and I have to admit, when back in 2020, before the pandemic, when you looked at the World Economic Forum report on risk factors, all the top risk was environment, and I think the whole community was like, yes, they finally get it, and then pandemic hit, and I think
okay, great.
Many of us were okay. Now we like focus on finance and don't have the resources to anything else. But clearly the pandemic have shown something else. It's shown that yes, cash is king. You do need to have cash in order to survive as a business, but care is the queen. And if you don't care for your stakeholders, for your the environment, etc., you are going to be held accountable. So I think what we have seen here during the pandemic is this emotional intelligence, this caring that have taken a whole new level. And I think we've seen it with employees. We've had employees that just, walking out. We also had that before the pandemic. We've seen it with customers that have taken a stand. We've seen it with shareholders taking a stand. I think we are in a situation now where this, how I go to work and as a person with values, etc., is also how you are at work, which is very easy when you are at home all the time at the moment, right? So I think we taking that with us, and we will take that with us, I hope, in terms of the future, and really embed both the environmental and social, being aware in everything we do, including in the reporting. And I think we need to ensure that we, in the boardroom, in the C-suite, the accountants, everyone asks the questions related to, okay, is this the way we also will look like in a 1.2 world, in a 2.1 world, in a 2.5 Celsius warming world? How will we have stranded assets? Will we have, what impact will this have on our employees? What impact will the fourth industrial revolution have on our employees? Are we starting to train our employees to do other things? Sorry, everyone, but there is a lot more weight on our shoulders in terms of our stewardship today than there was just a few years ago.
Isn't that the truth? Are accountants going to take the lead on reporting the reduction in carbon emissions?
Accountants will save the world. I said that before. Then I started saying board of directors will save the world. But let's say we will all save the world. Yes, of course. Of course. I mean, the reason Accounting for Sustainability, so His Royal Highness, A4S, working in terms of the CFOs, fantastic work. Clearly, all of the accounting standards are doing fantastic work. The ACAS, you're doing fantastic work. I think I'm going back to you need to stay curious, you need to stay competent, but courageous. And that is you need to act. It's not enough to know it and then sit and wait. You need to act and go out and ask those questions. And I know it's not always the easy thing to do, and I know that's not everyone want to hear all of these measures, but I think from an accountant point of view, it's the right thing to do to make sure that your clients and the board of directors and others are aware of the impact of the business, and what impact will that not only have on the financials but also on stakeholders and the long-term value of the company.
Yes, I think it's the bold and daring leadership, right? And any quick recommendations on key resources to educate yourself? There's a lot to learn. It can be overwhelming to start in terms of ESG knowledge. Any sort of top place to start?
Is this when I can say that the ESG Competent Board Certificate and Designation Program that we are putting out? But of course, it depends who you are. There's so much out there, and A4S have theirs, SASB have theirs, GRI have theirs. I mean, there's so much out there. But clearly, if that are interested in getting the global mindset, I would be pleased to welcome you in terms of the ESG Competent Certificate Program.
Thank you so much, Helle. You are a wealth of knowledge, and we've all learned so much here today. And also, you've sparked curiosity to learn more, and certainly lit the fire in terms of where CPAs, accountants need to take things, being courageous, and as you suggest, will take things. So fantastic. Thank you so much.